Hi, everyone. We're going to just wait a few more minutes for a couple of slow pokes to join us, and then we'll get started. And it's nice to have, this is a nice little group here. I'm going to wait one more minute and then we'll get started. This is nice to see Dina here. Dina's going to be one of our speakers. I think our speaker next for the next seminar. So this is exciting. So welcome. It's great to have you here. All right, let's get started. It's 2 minutes past the hour. So welcome everyone to the first session of our new seminar series, Ambivalent Activism. I'm really excited. Of course, I have a package coming, so I'm going to have to unfortunately just go ahead and power through this while you hear the buzzing at my door. So I'm really excited to explore with you guys ideas about emotion, protest, and resistance over the next 6 months. I'm Akugo Imijulu, and I'm a professor of sociology at the University of Warwick, and I'm a co-organizer of the series with my beloved former colleagues from the University of Edinburgh, Marlies Koets-Tatra and Callum McGregor, who are both lecturers at the Morehouse School of Education at the University of Edinburgh. So I'll be your chair for the event for this event, and I'm going to kind of give you a few starting remarks. This is actually a package for a friend who's having a baby, so this is actually embarrassing. So whatever. I'll give you guys a few starting remarks about the seminar series. Then I'm going to introduce our two speakers. The speakers will speak for 20 minutes each, and then we'll take questions at the end because we've hopefully tried to curate the seminar series where the speakers, there are kind of echoes and connections between them. And so we'll just take all the questions at the end because I think that'll be best. So this seminar series, we're seeking kind of ways in which we can think about ambivalence and its relationship to activism. For the purposes of this series, we're defining ambivalence as, quote, the simultaneous experience of positive and negative emotional or cognitive orientations towards a person, situation, object, task, goal, or idea, and the feelings of tension and conflict that result. And we're taking that definition from Rothman and colleagues from 2017. And I think we've all had a lesson in ambivalence during the lockdown. And I think we've all been struggling on how to kind of reconcile our conflicting emotions and feelings about kind of being trapped at home and thinking about what it means for those who are laboring on our behalf during these moments. So Marlies, Callum, and I all came to an idea of ambivalence and ambivalent activism through different paths. So in my work exploring women of color's activism in Europe, I've been particularly struck by how activists have to negotiate and kind of deal with these kind of simultaneous emotions related to kind of the sense of joy in terms of collective action, but also the exhaustion of precarity, the exhaustion of white supremacy, the exhaustion of kind of working with allies who don't seem to be on your side, but also dealing with issues to do with care, but then care in the context of extreme economic precarity and vulnerability. And how we can't understand issues of joy and exhaustion or care and precarity without each other. So they co-constitute each other. And for Callum and Marlies, they've been thinking about how hope and existential dread, unfortunately, sadly, commingle and shape young people's climate justice activism. And so trying to think about what, trying to hold these two kind of opposing emotions and ideas in one's mind is something that's, that we want to kind of explore through the context of activism. And so we're really excited, and we really want to kind of think through these ideas with you. And on that note, we are actually organizing a special issue proposal. We're organizing a special issue proposal. Hold on a second. Oh, sorry, can you just leave it at the door, please? Thank you. This is actually, I know this, I get so many packages delivered. I know this guy, and he always talks to me about Texas, and so it's very nice. Anyway, so we're organizing a special issue proposal to showcase this work, and we'll circulate, when it's ready, we'll circulate that to you, because we would love to kind of have your contributions. So without further ado, let me introduce our two speakers. So Cristina Florescu is a Romanian writer and political organizer living in Dublin. She has been involved in community work since 2018, organizing on a range of issues from reproductive health to prison abolition. She's currently working on developing her understanding and practice of mutual aid and restorative justice. Our second speaker is Maša Mrovlje. I'm sorry, we practiced pronouncing Maša's last name several times, and I bottled it, so I'm very sorry. Maša Mrovlje is a Marie Curie Rewire Fellow at the Department of Political Science at the University of Vienna. Her research interests are located within contemporary political theory with a focus on theories of resistance and resistance movements. She is the author of Rethinking Political Judgment, A Rent in Existentialism, and she's currently working on a project on disappointment, reclaiming the unfulfilled promise of resistance, which explores the political potential of disappointment within the modern revolutionary tradition. Come on, get out of here with all this. It's absolutely fantastic. I'm really looking forward to both of your talks. So without further ado, let me hand over to Cristina. Cristina, thank you.
Thank you. I'm just going to share my screen, and I hope everyone can see. Yeah, thank you for the introduction and for having me here today. My name is Cristina, and I'm going to talk about a project I was part of during the pandemic called the Embroidery Collective, and how this group helped the members deal with quote unquote negative feelings like grief, hopelessness, loneliness, while also creating a community at a time where communal experiences were impossible. Sorry, I'll just make this full screen now. So to start from the beginning, the Embroidery Collective is a group of women and marginalized genders from migrant and ethnic minority backgrounds who used to organize together before the pandemic on issues like reproductive justice, housing, anti-racism and anti-fascism, and we found ourselves isolated and away from those kind of community connections when the pandemic started. Some of us were dealing with a lot of feelings that I think everyone was dealing with during the pandemic. Some of us had unfortunately gone through different losses. They had lost a person, while others were grieving maybe more abstract losses like the loss of our communities and our connections and life as we knew them, as we knew it. So then the collective was started by one of our members who's a textile artist, and at first came up with an idea to take a piece of fabric, and this is the piece of fabric in question, and post it from member to member for each of us to embroider something on it, whatever we wanted, to our best abilities. So you can see here that some people got more adventurous and embroidered plants and different symbols and motifs that were meaningful for them at the time, and others were a bit shyer and just did some dots and crosses. But the point was to have this piece of fabric as a material symbol of our connection, and we used it to keep in touch with each other and update each other on our progress. And also then the fabric became quite a beautiful, almost poetic representation of connection, because it not only became rich in embroidery, but it also got shinier and softer as we were passing it from hand to hand. So I think particularly during a pandemic where touching things was dangerous, having a piece of fabric that changed textures as we touched it, I think there's something quite beautiful about that. So after this, the same member secured some funding from the Arts Council of Ireland and Create, which meant that we could develop the project a bit more and give it more structure. So we were able to pay for an artist fee for our member. We were able to get a mentor, another artist named Isabel Lima. We were able to get hoops and linen and equipment for each of our members. And then the theme we developed around this project was exploring our cultures and sharing knowledge about our cultures. Like I said, our members are people from minority ethnic and migrant backgrounds, and our members identify with a range of cultures. So including Malaysia, Romania, Honduras, India, Pakistan, Japan, China, and Iran. So, cultures from around the globe, truly diverse and different cultures. And then what we decided on was to each create our own piece of embroidery, our samplers, kind of in dialogue with the embroidery history or textile history of each of our cultures. The funding that we got meant that we could do some workshops together and embroider together. So this is our first workshop where we got together and followed a tutorial so that we could practice different types of embroidery, because for most of us, this was a new kind of hobby or a new challenge. So this was our very first one. And then afterwards, we had some workshops with our mentor, Isabel Lima, and also just casual online embroidery sessions where we just get together and update each other on each other's lives and gossip and chat and have some sort of feeling of connection while embroidering. I just wanted to put some examples from our knowledge sessions. So we also had a virtual meeting where each of us created a presentation on the textile and embroidery history of our culture. So this is an example on weaving in Japan, and another example from another member on Persian rugs and Persian embroidery. And these are some of our samplers. So you can see influences from different cultures in them. And you can also see that some people went in a greater level of detail, some in less detail. There's also different progress. So even though the project was quite structured, there was no pressure as to what level of skill we needed to have for this or how much work we needed to do on it. It was just kind of a vessel to create a connection, and then we could embroider whatever we had capacity for. And now to bring it, I guess, to the notion of ambivalence and the theme of the series of webinars. When I was writing the proposal for this, I ended it with an open question, which was, what is more ambivalent than exploring grief, anger, and hopelessness through the peaceful act of embroidery? And I think certainly in Western cultures, when we think of embroidery, we think of a very dainty, feminized, and peaceful work, which was certainly true for some of our experiences. I think members used embroidery as a way of having some peaceful time, some rest from their daily pandemic anxieties, maybe as a meditative practice, but it was also a way to sit with more negative feelings, sit with your grief, your anger, your hopelessness. There was something very striking that our mentor Isabel told us, and it was that she discovered embroidery during the pandemic because the act of punching a hole with a needle through a piece of fabric was very cathartic, and it helped her express her anger. So then she created these beautiful political embroidery pieces. And I think that certainly applied to our experiences as well. And I wouldn't say that meditative practice existed separately from the more cathartic practice, but rather they coexisted. And that's maybe the material ambivalence that the collective inhabited. And then in terms of other forms of ambivalence, of course, it was a way of creating a community when, like I said, communal practices were literally unsafe. It was a way of creating connection where we're feeling very isolated. And it was even a way of having something to look forward to when every hope for the future seemed futile. You might then wonder what is so political about embroidery. And I think the short answer for me is everything. But to divide that into a few separate layers, I think firstly, the embroidery collective itself is political because of the identity of its members. Like I mentioned at the start, it was formed of women and marginalized genders, queer people, people of color. I think generally people whose identity exists at the intersection of many marginalized groups. So our existence in itself is political. And then if you look at embroidery even historically, as we were sharing knowledge from our different cultures, I think a common theme was that embroidery has always been political in the sense that it has always been used primarily by women to get together and gossip and update each other and create a space for themselves in a world that didn't appreciate them and didn't value them. So I think that's generally political about embroidery. And it certainly applied to the embroidery collective because in a similar way, it helped us create a space for ourselves in a world that didn't value the feminized work we do. And maybe didn't value our politics as much either. And that leads me to the next 2 points. The first one is that the political aspect of embroidery, the embroidery collective was, in terms of political organizing, turning inwards and using feminized work that is often devalued in political activism and turning towards community care and mutual aid as a form of being politically active. And also the second thing that leads me to is that, at least for me, the most political part about joining the embroidery collective was the fact that it allowed me to distance myself from this narrative of false positivity that was so predominant especially during the first wave of lockdowns. So in a similar way in which historically embroidery would have been used by women to create a space in a world that didn't appreciate them, I feel like for me, it was a way to create a space for myself in a world that didn't think the way I did about the pandemic. I was personally very frustrated with kind of the discourse of we need to keep on keeping on and adapt to the new normal and use this time to maybe get a new hobby or bake some bread or get a new skill, because God forbid we don't get a skill out of this massive trauma. But essentially we had to do everything possible but sit down and reckon with the unprecedented collective trauma we were all going through. And I think the embroidery collective gave me a space to do just that, to kind of take the act of embroidery, which was a new hobby for me, but not put this whole false positivity narrative around it, but rather use it to explore whatever feelings I was having, or use it as a tool to deal with my feelings in whatever way, whether by escaping them or really sitting with them. So then I would like to round up the presentation with some learnings I personally took from the collective, and also a cute photo of us sharing our work in the park. I think the 3 main things I got out of this experience was learning that political organizing can take many forms. Like I said, I think in political organizing, we tend to celebrate the people who go out in the street or make the big speeches or put their body and their mind out for the cause, but not the people who do the care work, maybe make the tea so that the organizing can happen, or look after the children so other people can go in the street. And I would encourage people to think of that care work as political organizing in itself. Political organizing can be turning inwards and looking after your community in whatever way that might be needed. And that leads me to don't be afraid to explore the valued ways of organizing, which tends to be the feminized care work, the emotional labor. And also communities can exist in different ways. I think the challenge of the pandemic was to think about our relationships and our communities in a different kind of way and make those ways meaningful. So kind of summing up those 2 previous points, communities can exist around a new hobby like embroidery, or maybe around a cooking group because your members are struggling to keep themselves fed. Communities can exist around a political issue like reproductive justice, but they can also exist around whatever it is that your immediate relations need. I think during the pandemic, I came back a lot to the question of what is a community, given that I felt so isolated from mine. And I think the answer I landed on was a community is a group of people who come together around the same interest and are accountable to each other. So a community can exist around embroidery, it can exist around housing activism, it can exist around whatever you want it to exist. So that's me and the Embroidery Collective, and I hope this was interesting and helpful for people, and I know there's going to be questions after. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Cristina. That was absolutely fantastic. And wow. And I just, it's very funny that, yes, so you were really unhappy with kind of the need for you to kind of make your sourdough starter and like learn how to bake and all the rest of it. Like, so it's very interesting that you were like, I absolutely am not going to participate in the constant productivity culture. And I think that's actually really interesting and important. And we'll have questions for you afterwards. So thank you for that. Maša, you're up next.
Thanks so much. So I'm gonna try to share my screen as well. See. Hopefully this works. Okay, first of all, I just want to say thank you to the organizers of this exciting series. It's a real pleasure and privilege to get the opportunity to present here. Thanks, Akugo, for your kind introduction, to Cristina for your wonderful presentation, and of course to all of you for joining us today. Right, so today I'll be presenting a paper on the disappointments of Rosa Luxemburg, Rethinking Political Commitment Beyond Left Melancholia. What I do in the paper is draw on Luxemburg's disappointment to rethink and revive revolutionary commitment in and for an age of left melancholia. As most of you will know, the condition of left melancholia commonly refers to an abiding sense of loss, disappointment, and despair in response to the failure of past utopian aspirations. This sense of loss, further, is held to hinder the left's ability to engage in meaningful socio-political analysis and respond to the challenges of the present moment. I argue that Luxemburg's grappling with her experiences of disappointment can help us avoid the two dominant contemporary responses to the loss of past utopian visions, namely reformism and new communism. On the one hand, we have reformist scholars such as Eric Olin Wright, who have approached the failure of past revolutionary ideals as an opportunity to revise the stale frames of revolutionary thought and revive political commitment through a reformist politics attentive to the unpredictability of political action. On the other hand, new communist critics such as Jody Dean have bemoaned the perceived lack of radicality in these contributions and called for a return to the past models of militant revolutionary struggle. Now, while the first response can have a stifling effect on our sense of political possibility, the other risks submerging contemporary struggles under a pre-given model that is out of touch with the changing realities of our time. I argue that we do not need to accept the binary choice between these two positions, where past failures necessitate a reformist accommodation with the existing system, or where a compromising stance of reform justifies a return to the old model of revolutionary struggle. I make the argument by drawing on Luxemburg's disappointment over the failures of the socialist movement before and during the First World War. Specifically, I focus on her disappointment over the movement's reliance on the criterion of success and the refusal to run the risk of failure. Calculations of usefulness, in Luxemburg's view, characterized both the reformist strand of the movement and the revolutionary politics of Lenin and the Bolsheviks. To ward off the risk of failure, the reformists prioritized gradual reform over a revolutionary transformation of society, thus limiting their endeavors to what was deemed possible within the existing system. The Bolsheviks, in turn, sought to ensure the success of the revolution by grounding revolutionary commitment in a set of ready-made prescriptions enacted by the party leadership, while betraying the democratic character of revolutionary politics. In contrast to both of these positions, Luxemburg's disappointment encourages us to reorient political commitment away from the pursuit of pre-given goals and towards upholding democratic forms of revolutionary politics that can incorporate and sustain the uncertain and fallible nature of concerted political action. This rethinking of political commitment, I contend, can help us avoid the two dominant tendencies that structure contemporary responses to left melancholia. For it reveals behind both reformism and new communism a desire to offset the risk of failure and manage revolutionary action in line with pre-given goals, while betraying its democratic, unpredictable, and fallible character. Luxemburg's grounding of commitment in experiences of democratic revolutionary action, in contrast, embraces uncertainty as an inevitable part of attempts at a radical transformation of society. Thus, it gets sustained dedication to radical change in the face of adverse circumstances today, when the assurances of past utopian visions are sorely missing. Now, in my turn to Luxemburg, I contribute to the rich scholarship that has listed her embrace of failure, uncertainty, and complexity of revolutionary action as one of her lasting contributions to revolutionary theory and practice. Yet these accounts have not explored how Luxemburg's rethinking of political commitment is grounded in her experiences of disappointment, and specifically in her unique way of dealing with her experiences of disappointment, which importantly speaks to recent efforts to respond to left melancholia. As her correspondence attests, Luxemburg was often in despair, enraged, horrified, almost broken by what she interpreted to be major setbacks of revolutionary politics. What distinguished her is that she refused to give in to her disappointment. Instead, she viewed it as a necessary step on the path towards revolution and as an opportunity to rethink the established patterns of revolutionary commitment. Unearthing the relevance of Luxemburg's disappointment may seem counterintuitive in a way, right? Because she was often considered to be this true example of the ruthless adherence to the pure revolutionary principle. But her grappling with her disappointment shows that there was nothing self-evident in her commitment. It was something to be constantly fostered, to be constantly revivified. Specifically, attentiveness to her experiences of disappointment is crucial in helping us think the experience of commitment and the difficulty of sustaining it in the face of adverse circumstances. Luxemburg's response to her disappointment led her to adopt the idea of revolution as a path paved with failures and defeats from which the revolutionaries can learn and gain the necessary experience, knowledge, and strength for the final victory. On the one hand, I tease out how her disappointment over the reformist politics within the workers' movement led her to resist the tendency towards compromise that accompanied the perceived impossibility of radical change. Instead, she linked the experience of failure to the development of a political consciousness among the masses. On the other hand, I show how her disappointment over the revolutionary politics of the Bolsheviks led her to ground proper revolutionary commitment in the broadest democratization of revolutionary action, rather than the ready-made prescriptions of the select few. Now, I'd be happy to talk more about Luxemburg's engagement with the reformists and the Bolsheviks during the Q&A, perhaps, but in the remainder of this presentation, I'd like to focus on how Luxemburg's rethinking of political commitment can help us avoid the two tendencies that structure contemporary responses to left melancholia. As I said before, we have, on the one hand, a reformist politics of compromise, and on the other hand, a new communist insistence on the old model of revolutionary change. Let me start with how Luxemburg helps us move beyond compromise. Here, what's crucial is that Luxemburg's disappointment warns us against viewing failure as a phenomena that defines the boundary between the realistic and the unrealistic, between the possible and the impossible, between what's feasible and what's not feasible. I develop in the paper how this politically troubling understanding of failure haunts the reformist responses to left melancholia, such as Wright's project of real utopia. Now, I want to be very clear on this point that the criticism of this position is not meant to reject the desirability of reformist projects per se, or even of Wright's project of real utopia. The problem that I want to highlight is that his outline of viable possibilities is structured in a way that destines more radical, revolutionary challenges to capitalism for failure. For instance, since past examples of ruptures with capitalism have resulted in forms of authoritarian, state bureaucratic forms of economic organization, rather than genuinely socialist alternatives to capitalism, Wright concludes that attempts at radical transformation are not viable. This fear of failure to evoke the lessons of Luxemburg's disappointment not only blurs the transformative potential of Wright's own proposals for sustainable emancipatory alternatives to capitalism, it also precludes in advance the possibility of radical change, removing it to the realm of a distant and likely unachievable future. Luxemburg's disappointment, in contrast, grounds political commitment precisely in the realization that radical transformation is not easy and can only proceed through past defeats. This rethinking of political commitment moves us beyond the reformist managing of what is viable or achievable in two ways. First, it dispenses with the idealized visions of resistance as immediately effective, visions that breed disenchantment at the first brush with the complexities, setbacks, and failures of resistant action. Thus, it can resist the hegemonic attempts to entrench in resistors or the general populace a sense of cynicism about the possibility of radical change. For instance, the disappointment over the failures of the 2011 Egyptian revolution quickly led some to denounce the uprisings as naive, as reckless, as misguided, or as not worthwhile. Luxemburg's disappointment helps us recognize how such narratives rely on an overly idealist reading of revolution that fails to account for the unavoidable complexities and failings of revolutionary action. In contrast, the refusal to rely on the assurances of success allows us to seize the possibilities for action in the present and let them unfold into the future rather than proclaiming them to be unrealizable in advance. Second, Luxemburg's grappling with her disappointment reconceptualizes failure as a productive side of possibility, which can come to serve as an inspiration for future projects of radical social transformation. On this account, even an uprising that failed, in the sense that it failed to bring about any immediate result, can effect a change in what is deemed possible and prepare the conditions for something new to emerge in the future. To return to the example of the Egyptian revolution, even though there's no guarantee that the democratic practices that sustained the revolutionary uprisings will be taken up again in the future, they have changed the conditions of possibility for future activity. Importantly, the change in conditions of possibility is not limited to a change in the resistor's mental disposition towards reality. It encompasses a shift in embodied habitual ways of being in the world that shape political action in the future. Okay, let me move now to how Luxemburg's disappointment warns us against the troubling tendency within the new communist discourse to manage revolutionary action by resorting to the old model of revolutionary change. In Jody Dean's case, the fear of unpredictability, disappointment, and failure leads to an insistence on the centralist hierarchical mode of organization that is to keep the protesters on the right path in terms of their aims and tactics. For instance, in her assessment of the Occupy Wall Street movement, she considered their plural, diverse character and their insistence on horizontal, non-hierarchical organization as a cause of their ultimate failure. The solution being proposed is for Occupy to develop into a new kind of communist party. This would help the movement to temper autonomy with solidarity add vertical and diagonal strength to the force of horizontality, and attune itself to the facts of leadership. Now, certainly attempts to control revolutionary action in accordance with a set of prescribed rules enacted by the party leadership may seem to secure the success of the revolution short term. But for Luxembourg, a true revolutionary commitment and a true transformation of society cannot be decreed. It can only be achieved through the broadest democratization of political action, through experiences of solidarity, of self-rule, which of course include the experiences of error and failure as its inevitable part. Again, there are two crucial insights that Luxembourg's rethinking of political commitment offers here. First, Luxembourg's embrace of uncertainty allows us to see experiences of failure as occasions for the maturing of political commitment, including the adaptability and responsiveness to the situation at hand, resilience in the face of adversity, as well as further efforts to democratize revolutionary action. In the case of Occupy, for instance, the activists expressed their disappointment with the exclusionary practices within the movement, including colonial, white supremacist, and heteronormative dynamics, as well as an underlying current of classism and unequal power in decision-making processes. But in many cases, this disappointment further energized their efforts to develop innovative, democracy-enhancing practices and procedures. In other cases, their disappointment helped channel their energies to new movements and projects that reflected participatory organizational models. The activist disappointment here certainly seems to echo Luxembourg's lesson to broaden the freedom to make mistakes as the only way forward. Second, Luxembourg's rethinking of political commitment is kindled by the awareness that, in contrast to liberation from, liberation for, to quote Lewis Gordon, is the rallying of creative resources of possibility. For this reason, her grappling with the complexities of commitment shifts the focus of concern from transforming the revolutionary moment into political power and towards carrying the unpredictable moment of revolutionary process into the future. Here, the public, democratic life does not become superfluous after liberation, but is in fact the crucial part of the revolutionary process, before and after the revolution. Thus, it's the embrace of uncertainty that issues a call to an inclusive and democratic revolutionary practice, contesting the necessity of pre-given formulas and anti-democratic measures on the way to lasting change. I'm just going to quickly conclude and wrap up. So Luxembourg's disappointment teaches us that commitment to radical change is not opposed to, but coextensive with the acceptance of uncertainty and the risk of failure. What it encourages is an openness to the future that can help us embrace on-the-ground struggles against oppression without proclaiming them to be unrealistic in advance or trying to control and manage them in line with established patterns of revolutionary thought. The embrace of uncertainty as an inevitable part of attempts at a radical transformation of society further highlights the importance of learning from failure within a single struggle, between different struggles, and intergenerationally. The transformative potential of this vision of political commitment lies in tying the meaning of revolutionary actions to the relations of solidarity they stirred into being and the new possibilities they open for the future, rather than to the specific results they achieved or failed to achieve. Okay, I'm going to stop here. Thank you for your attention, and I look forward to your questions and the discussion.
That was wonderful, Maša. Thank you so much for that. That was so interesting, and it's really great to see kind of the revival of Luxembourg's thought over the last 5, 6, 7 years, and so it's really interesting to see that. Right, folks. So questions. Oh, we have lots of time. This is fantastic. So it looks like we have lots of time for questions, and we might even finish early depending on how chatty you guys are. So I see that Kay has a question. Kay, rather than my reading it out, do you just want to unmute and ask this question about activism?
Well, thank you very much. And as I put in the chat, thank you to both speakers. You're bringing new ideas, so I might sound very naive in terms of it, but actually those are the most stimulating seminars, so thank you once again. And I just wondered, particularly Cristina, I was really interested about what you thought about definitions of activism based on your presentation. And I put in the chat just the one that used in the seminar series. And I was just curious, in what way would you agree with it, change it, expand it? Does my question make any sense?
Yeah, I'll just quickly read your definition there.
Yeah, I mean, I can say it. By activism, we mean a collective process of individuals coming together to make change in public space. I was particularly thinking, you just got me going thinking about change, public space. What does public space mean? That's a real issue in itself. Yeah, I was just curious. Or maybe you would just put in different words. Yeah.
Yeah, I think I've struggled for a while with this notion of activism, not necessarily based on this definition, but rather how the term has been co-opted. I don't know, for me, activism requires a great amount of community involvement. And yes, it requires making change, but I guess like Maša's presentation pointed out, change doesn't happen so quickly or so easily. So activism can also be more about, for me, more about community and accountability, and I guess making change in a public space, yes, but also making change within your immediate community and the relationships you have with other people, or within yourself and the way you relate to different concepts that have been thrown at us from the outside world. So yeah, I've kind of, in my own life, I've replaced the notion of activism more with community work or community organizing, because I think this idea of activism for me doesn't focus as much on the public space, or the public space, changing the public space is a part of it. But for me, the more important parts are looking after and being accountable to my immediate community. So I don't know if that answers your question, Kay.
Thank you. Is there enough time for me to come back quickly, Akugo and Cristina?
Yeah, of course.
Yeah. But yeah, don't let me murder. And also I know Cristina and Melon, I can see she's on it. And we've been, maybe to say one thing is that in the children's field, we've been, I would almost say, trying out the word activism, because it positions children quite differently. And we say maybe in good ways. So it's interesting that like we're trying to claim it in some ways as being an improvement on participation, but maybe it isn't. And I guess I was wondering then, Cristina, like, can you be, is activism always collective? Is one thought I had. And I guess you're moving away from using activism, which I sympathize with. And I guess it's, what is the power of the term activism, as well as what its deficits are. That's my immediate response.
To answer the first question, yes, activism is collective for me, because I don't think it can be effective if it's individual. I think I only have so much power and so much capacity to think about things. And I think there's, for me, in the communities I have existed in, it has been, the greatest value has been to get other people's input and other people's experience of life so that my politics can get better. So yeah, activism is collective. And then in terms of what are the strengths of activism, I don't know, I guess if I was to get into the semantics of the notion of being active, it's, I guess, it might be a term that gives people that first push into getting involved in something, and maybe their politics then evolve, or the way they call themselves evolve afterwards. So yeah.
Thank you, Cristina. Maša, do you have, because I want to come in here in a minute, but I don't want to abuse my chair's privilege to talk about activism. But Maša, do you have, would you like to respond to Kay's questions about how you're thinking about activism in relation to Luxembourg?
Yeah, thanks, Akugo and Kay, for your question. I guess I agree with Cristina that it's always collective, but then it can also have individual effects. So I think the level of individual and collective, they're constantly in a kind of a relationship. And for Luxemburg, I think it's also really important to constantly broaden these public spaces, to broaden the scope of activism, so to speak. So it's not just about political issues. Even for Luxemburg at that time, it was also about the women's question, about many other issues that really question this binary between private and public.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. And I think that's right. So for the series coordinators, what we wanted to do with an idea of activism is keep it as broad as possible, because it is important for what Cristina and Maša are saying to think about activism not just as kind of spectacular protests, but especially, as Cristina said, it's thinking about all of the caring and disrespected feminized work that happens in the background that is unsexy and mostly unrecognized, that makes those kinds of spectacular protests possible. And so thinking about all of the caring labor is also part of activism. But we wanted to have something as open as possible in order to have like 40 people in this room today, so which is fabulous. And I think I probably have other views about, activism versus participation versus community work, because I don't think they're all the same thing, but that's maybe a conversation for another time. Gabriella, you have your hand up, and then I also see Dina and Alma with questions. We will come to you next, but Gabriella.
Hi, hello, thank you everyone. I thought the presentations were really interesting, and I'm a lecturer of sociology of emotions at Edinburgh. So this themes that you're talking about, it's really cognizant with my work, which is about feminist activism in Brazil. And I speak about the sociology of emotions in feminist activism in Brazil. So there's a lot of common ground here with your work. So thank you very much, because I took several notes and made me think a lot about my work. And when Maša was presenting, I was just thinking of a quote. So this is a comment, and then I'll go to my question, so please bear with me. By Professor Cornel West during the Black Lives Matter protests in 2020. That was in a brilliant interview that he gave on TV, talking about this possibility of revolution, and in terms of the Black movement in the US and the history of that. And he quoted Samuel Beckett saying, "Try again, fail better." And it just makes me think about like what you were saying about this importance of failure, and failure as part of the process and part of the recognition of new ways of continuing. But my question was about time, actually, because on my research, I look at consciousness raising activities in the 80s in Brazil and elsewhere, and looking at hashtag feminism as digital consciousness raising, and thinking about this kind of sporadic bursts of energy of activism in different decades and different possibilities that the digital affords for that. And I was thinking about how you conceptualize time, because I think for both of you, like the knitting or embroidery during the pandemic, the pandemic had this specific passing of time that was as if time was not really happening. And so today we don't know if something happened 2 years ago or a year ago. We get confused with time. So I was wondering if this idea of time, how it was present during activism during the pandemic, or however you want to call it. And for Maša as well, like looking at Rosa Luxemburg and thinking of the past, as you already worked with Hannah Arendt as well, and thinking about how these ideas of like the past, how it happened in the past, and how things kind of repeat themselves, or maybe not repeat, but they rhyme in a way, because they happen as well. But this spectacular activism, these moments of like explosion of protests, and combined with the caring activities, as like Google was saying now, how we kind of understand this as part of the process as well, and how the two of you conceptualize time in your work. So sorry for the really long question, but that was it. Thank you so much.
No, it's fine. Thank you very much. It's super interesting. Gosh, we get to meet, well, I guess Callum and Marlies get to meet all these people you probably didn't know at Edinburgh. So this is nice for you guys. Anyway, Cristina, let's go to you first with this fantastic question of how did you rethink or think about time in relation to embroidery and your kind of collective work with the collective?
I think in a way, time was one of the things that pushed the collective, or that made the collective happen, because we were a group of people who would have organized in more politically traditional ways, or more activism traditional ways outside of the embroidery collective, and we found ourselves that we, like, among the anxiety we were feeling, or maybe the responsibilities of care we had within our lives, we didn't have the time or the capacity to engage with community and activism in the ways we would have before. So I guess the way time came into the embroidery collective was that the collective was partially born out of a need to create time for ourselves, or to create time to keep those connections in a way that everyone had capacity for. And then I can only speak for my practice, but for me, it became a way of feeling like I was using my time for something, or marking the passing of time, because like Gabriella said, we lived in this kind of time warp where there was no past, present, or future. So it was nice to have something to put time aside for, or something to dedicate an hour in the future for, like mark the passing of time through my embroidery progress even. So yeah, I think on one side it had some part to play in making the collective happen, because that was the kind of time and capacity that the members had. And on another side, it helped us mark the passing of time, or feel like we were using our time for something enjoyable.
It's so interesting. I love how you meant all these different ways of thinking about time with the collective, right? And this idea of marking the passage of time and putting time aside and kind of grounding yourself in time is really interesting. Maša, I don't know if you have anything to say about time, but I guess you should, because time, particularly in relation to the past connecting to the present and future, and the question about the past and history in relation to Arendt and Luxemburg.
Yeah, thanks. Gabriela, I love your question. And it really made me think of these two notions of time in Luxemburg, or maybe there are even more, right? On the one hand, what you say are these more sporadic bursts of energy, these ruptures, right, in normal time. But on the other hand, also what you referred to as the passing of time, the long periods when she was in prison, for example, when, you know, she struggled to get any news from the outside world. It was a very different conception of time. And also when you read her diary and her correspondence, it was really as if in those moments of despair, she almost lapsed back into the more perhaps traditional Marxist understanding of time as unfolding in line with certain inevitable laws of history. So we have that element in her as well, even though she then always jumped back and said, no, it's about human action. It's not about, nothing's going to happen inevitably, nothing's going to happen necessarily. It's up to us to change history, even though it's not in the conditions that we could choose. But so just to kind of connect it quickly to Arendt, I think in terms of how Luxemburg helps us learn from failure and this notion of failing better as well, I think perhaps it's good to evoke the Benjaminian notion of constellations, where it's about connecting moments in the past with the present and the future, but freeing them from any linear narratives, but to kind of draw on them contextually, make them speak to the present, make them a living reality in our world, rather than lapse back into these processual notions of inevitable progress. And I think this is especially important when you talk about left melancholia and the two kind of responses to left melancholia, which it seems to me are very much based on trying to put these past failures and link them in a certain more linear model to the present, where a past failure leads into a certain clear lesson in the present. For example, the failure of past socialism means it wasn't realistic, therefore we moved to a more reformist stance. Or in Jodie Dean's case, the past failure, well, it was nothing to do with our attachment to past revolutionary aspirations. It had to do with our abandonment of these aspirations. So past failure merely means we need to bounce back and resurrect the past model. And what I'm trying to get at with Luxemburg, and I guess, as you were saying, the conception of time is really important here, is a certain different kind of learning, examining past failures contextually, seeing how we could respond to them, learn from them, but not to kind of submerge them under these pre-given models or frames of reference, I guess.
Wonderful. Oh, that was wonderful. And it reminds me, I need to go back and read some Walter Benjamin, I think. So I haven't read him in a long time. So this is really helpful. Thank you so much. Okay. So a question from Dina. Do you want to just unmute and ask your question rather than having me read it out?
Yeah. Can you hear me now? Because I'm
Yes.
not sure. Yeah. Yeah. Well, thank you very much, both of you guys. It was really made me think a lot about melancholia in a kind of more broad sense, public sense, but also in terms of being melancholic as individuals, because I have a history of very severe depression. So yeah, it was kind of interesting to listen to that. So my question is about this notion of armchair activism, and armchair activists, and sometimes I was quite active on Twitter for a while and in mental health politics, and there was a lot of sometimes accusation of people being armchair activists, basically, you know, kind of preaching from the luxury of their lounge. And this was used with sarcasm and contempt. But on the other hand, there are people in the survivor movement, the psychiatric survivor movement, that because of their histories and problems can't really go out in the streets, and they have to be doing their work from a chair because they can't go out in the streets. So, you know, this notion of armchair activism is a kind of has a double edge, I think, because on the one hand, you know, yeah, you can say, yes, you kind of preach and about big ideas about, you know, from the luxury of your, you know, of your lounge. But on the other hand, there are people who can't go out and do these big protests, but they do really important work either through their writing or through social media. So yeah, that was my question.
Really interesting and very helpful. And just there's a rethinking of this idea of armchair activism. So it'll be interesting to see what Cristina and Maša think. So Cristina first, then Maša.
Yeah, I hadn't heard the term before, but I have certainly come across the contempt against people who would be very active on social media for politically, I mean. And I think it would be very hypocritical of me to do a whole presentation on devalued forms of activism and then go and say armchair activism is not good. So I think there's certainly value in being active on social media and raising awareness on certain issues on social media. And yeah, like you said, there's maybe accessibility issues or issues of personal circumstance or mental capacity or whatever might come into play there. And that doesn't mean that the work or the contribution is invaluable. So for me, it's not as much about the medium in which you're politically active or the way that you choose, but rather what your politics are and how are you contributing to a more radical view or deconstruction or of some form of oppression, or the way your political contribution influences the more general opinion on a certain topic. And that can be through street protest and through social media. I think they're both equally valuable to me.
Really helpful, thank you. Maša?
Yeah, I agree with what Cristina said. I think there's definite value in, even academic engagement. I think there's so many avenues where change is needed, and any kind of any engagement is to be valued. But on the term of armchair activism, I always think of the debate between Sartre and Camus, and Camus' charge against Sartre about how he turned his chair in the direction of history. So I do think there's something to be recognized here, perhaps, and that is the danger of more academic interventions getting too abstract and perhaps losing their ground in concrete struggles on the ground. And so I think in those kind of cases, perhaps it's good to be careful about that kind of involvement. But otherwise, I agree with what Cristina said, for sure.
That's great. Maša keeps name checking all these people I haven't read in years. I'm like, oh my God, when's the last time I read Camus? Right, okay, this is fantastic. Okay, so Alma, then Marlies, and then I see Stuart has his hand up. Okay, so Alma, do you want to unmute and ask your question, please?
Yeah, hello everyone. And first of all, thank you for the two amazing presentations. I focus on my PhD on mental health activism, so it's been really nice and refreshing to listen to you guys. And I had specifically a question for Cristina, because you kept on mentioning and centering this idea of accountability, which I haven't personally come across in my work on activism. So I thought that was a very interesting idea. And I thought maybe if you can elaborate a bit more on it, and especially if maybe go a bit more in depth with that question, because when I think of accountability, what comes to mind is also consistency. So yeah, and that's quite, I guess, ambivalent too. And do we need a need for consistency or not? And yeah, so I just wanted to ask you if you could elaborate on that idea of accountability within activism and the need for it.
Great question.
Yeah, I came across the notion of accountability more strongly recently, exploring the notions of prison abolition and restorative justice, which I should add before I go deeper into the answer that there are still notions I'm learning about, so I'm by no means an expert on it. But accountability, how I understand it, applies to groups or a sort of political activism and community organizing that tries to go beyond the punitive ways of existing in the world. And I'm not talking necessarily about prisons, but I guess think about how, if you're part of an activist group, how do you deal with conflict within your group? If two members are in conflict, does it mean one of them needs to leave for that conflict to be solved? Do we apply punishment or some sort of sanction to that member? Or do we talk through the conflict and try to resolve it and hold each other accountable? So for me, accountability is particularly important in terms of developing trust in a community. It means that I can trust someone in my community to act in the best interest of the community. And if they don't, that they will be open to being held accountable, and that productive conversations can be had out of uncomfortable situations. And then it is also connected for me with the notion of non-hierarchical organizing and not looking up to experts when you're organizing in a group. So if members are accountable to each other, it means that we're both on the same level and there is no hierarchy between us. And that's also key in the way I organize. I don't find it productive to be in a group where we have leaders and experts and we look up to them. I want everyone's input and opinions to be valued. And yeah, that is connected to consistency, I suppose, and that accountability always needs to be there. You can't be accountable for one action and then on the next action, the accountability disappears. So kind of to go deeper into accountability, it is a process, and it is a process of building trust and creating systems in place that go away from a conflict avoidant or a punitive way of dealing with conflict or uncomfortable situations or disagreements. I guess, does that answer your question?
Yeah, that was great. Thank you so much.
That's wonderful, Cristina. It reminds me of that text that was popular a few years ago, what conflict is not abuse, which is a really interesting kind of text about how to resolve and deal with conflict in activist groups. Which is really interesting. Maša, I don't know if you have anything to say about, we don't always have to have all of these questions come to both of you, but if you have something you want to say about accountability, please. No, you're okay? All right, well then we'll go to the next question, which is from Marlies, which is actually for you, Maša. So Marlies, go ahead and unmute and let us have it.
Yeah, thank you so much, both Cristina and Maša, for these amazing presentations. And yeah, my question is for Maša, and I have to admit that I'm not very familiar with Rosa Luxemburg's work at all, so this has been a really great insight. And I kept scribbling down little quotes from you, like failure does not define what is possible and impossible, and resistance and effect and so on. And I kept thinking about hope. I also kept thinking about the industrial action we're currently in higher education in the UK, and a lot of that really rang true as well. So I just wondered if is hope at all something around which you frame, or Rosa Luxemburg's work is framed, and do you have any insights on how to sustain hope in the face of adversity?
Thanks, Marlies. I'm so glad you asked this question about hope, because it's something I've been thinking for a while myself, and actually have been writing another paper on disappointed hope, where I turn not to Luxemburg but to Ernst Bloch, and his insight that so he says something like that that hope is actually the opposite of security, because if it could not be disappointed, it would not be hope. And so from him, I tried to kind of develop this account of what disappointed hopes can do in terms of actually not turning us away into withdrawal or compromise, but how it can bring us into a more kind of contextual, practice-based negotiation of the possibilities and limitations of political action in the present, kind of the Blockian movement from more abstract to more concrete hope. And so I would actually love to share the draft with you and get your comments. I would really appreciate, no pressure, of course, to read. I know we're all very busy, but yeah, that's kind of my initial thinking about that.
Really interesting. Disappointed hope. Man, if that doesn't kind of sum up the contemporary condition, who knows? That's actually a nicer way than kind of left melancholia, to be honest. But okay, Stuart had his hand up.
Thanks. Sorry, I'm just trying to find my the buttons. Thanks, Kugo and Cal and Marlies for organising this seminar, and thanks for the two presentations. They've been really great. I was just as you were talking there, you were making the point about hope, and I was reminded of the quotation. I think it's attributed to Saint Augustine that talks about hope has two beautiful daughters, anger and courage. Anger at the way things are, and courage that we should work to make sure they don't remain that way. And it strikes me that Marlies's point about industrial action, given that we're just back to work after 10 days of strikes, sounds like that's a really good way of thinking about it. I want to ask a specific question, but I also, I think, just want to make a very brief comment, if that's okay, about the presentations, if we have time for that. And but I think my point about the presentations being, they were really fascinating, and I think for me personally quite challenging, particularly Maša's one. And you know, and I'll declare an interest that I've been a card-carrying member of the Communist Party in Britain for, well, since my teenage years, which was in the 1970s. And I've been a kind of activist in that tradition in my life. So a lot of what Maša was saying was challenging, but in a really good way. And I didn't want to we could get into a whole range of debates that are be useful, but we've not got time. But there's 2 points I'd want to make. One would be that that notion of left melancholia. You know, I'm not melancholic, and the people that I associate with and the kind of political traditions that I'm from, I don't think feel melancholic at all. Another thing, I suppose, is this idea of the new communism. I suppose because I'm a member of a party that was founded in 1922, we must be old communists, and I certainly am an old communist. But I didn't understand. I mean, I'll be interested to develop that more. So what that's done for me, I think, is directed me to read your paper, Maša. It was really kind of interesting. I think these debates are really fruitful. But my question, I suppose, specifically, my interest is in activism is, from an educational point of view, is how do we engage and help people, particularly young people, to become activists, to develop the knowledge and the confidence, the kind of the kind of consciousness to become activists, because it's a really difficult thing to do, isn't it, putting your head above the parapet? So I'd be interested to hear from both of the speakers how can we support people to become activists? And particularly, I'm thinking of Rosa Luxemburg's role within the SPD, because she was, amongst other things, a kind of educator extraordinaire in the SDP party in terms of the kind of political schools that she was kind of organising and teaching. And so that's the kind of specific question, I suppose, is how do we develop activism?
Thank you, Stuart. Okay, Maša and then Cristina.
Thanks, Stuart. So with new communism, I just meant this recent kind of movement, meaning here examples such as Jody Dean, Badiou, Zizek, who have been turned new communists. But I, of course, understand that, you know, there isn't a break. There's much continuity, and so maybe we can think of other terms to frame this movement or this new theoretical direction as well. And in terms of how do we engage and help people develop consciousness, you're quite right. Luxemburg was, you know, she also drew much of her commitment from her educational experiences. So I think this is a two-way street, and I think education has a huge role to play. And I think going back to your question on communism and being a member of the party, this reminds me of Jody Dean's reply. She was once asked, you know, there was a person saying, oh, you know, I feel despair, basically. Look at what's happening, the rise in inequality, all these terrible things happening around the world. And Jody Dean said to her, join the party. That's a sure way for you to, you know, to be able to kind of get out of this despairing attitude and maintain political commitment. And I think there's a grain of truth there, because I think solidarity, experience of solidarity is really crucial here. Now, we may debate, right? Jody Dean, she's speaking from a specific perspective, right? Joining the Communist Party, it won't help everyone. And but I think non-hierarchical forms of solidarity are definitely something that's crucial to think about here in terms of how helping people to develop consciousness, also maintain it. It's not just about, you know, these bursts like we talked before. It's about maintaining a certain orientation through longer periods of time. And I think this is where failure as well, bearing the risk of failure or confronting failure, and solidarity on the other hand are really, it's crucial to think them together in a way, how to devise forms of solidarity that can withstand failure and the other way around.
That's great. Thank you, Maša. Cristina.
I think in terms of how to turn people to activism, my answer would be reconsider the definition of activism or what you understand by activism. I feel like if you make the notion of activism broader, you'll see that more people will fall into it. And I guess to give an example, just for the sake of keeping the answer clear and shorter, is activism taking the streets out of protest? Because in that case, that might imply police confrontation, which people of color and undocumented people won't want to do. That might have accessibility issues. That might have capacity issues, depending on what's going on in every person's life. On the other hand, can activism be anything that makes you have consciousness about a certain political issue? Is it posting on social media? Is it reading blogs? Is it being in community with people around whatever interest, like I said in my presentation, like around a shared interest or a shared belief? Because in that case, more people might feel like they're able to do that kind of work, that maybe they're not able to go out into the street, but they're able to post on social media. Maybe they're not good public speakers, but they can take care of other people in a really good way. So I think we need to expand what we understand by activism. And then we'll see that more people will fall into that definition. I also feel like a lot of people are activists by virtue of their identity, and their existence is political by virtue of race or sexual orientation or background. So they already exist in that circle, even though they might not fit a certain definition of activism. And then I think the way to maybe awaken political consciousness in people is by empowering them and providing the support they need. So do we tend to organize in a way that looks up to experts? Because then many people might not feel like they're experts, or they might not feel like their lived experiences are enough. Or are we empowering people to say, if you lived it, you are an expert on it, and you can talk and you can make mistakes and you can represent a movement? And also, are we providing people support, or are we expecting so much of people that they burn out? And we don't make, I guess, accommodations for their different circumstances. So I think the short answer would be expand what you understand by activism, and make sure that people are supported and empowered to participate and they feel welcome.
Thank you, Cristina. And I guess what's really interesting, it's like Stuart must be the only left man on the planet who doesn't feel a tinge of melancholia. So I'll have what you're having, but maybe that's like being a member of the Communist Party, which I'm not really down with. So anyway, Callum, you have your hand up. Callum, question.
Yeah, thanks. Hang on, I'll take my hand down there. Yeah, thank you. So just in relation to just kind of segueing from from Christina's point about sort of expanding or redefining activism, I kind of have a question and I'm trying to articulate it as I go. And it's really to Cristina and Maša. I think after listening to both of your talks, I was starting to come to this vague idea of kind of activism as parenthesis, if you like. Activism as a kind of parenthesis. Kind of meaning like activism as a kind of active intervention to create like time and space to kind of like step outside of, you know, these, I don't know what you want to put it, but these kind of everyday sort of hyper kind of rhythms of everyday life. And I kind of took that, I think, in different ways from both of your kind of from both of your kind of talks, you know, to step outside, if you like, you know, kind of capitalist rhythms, and do that kind of thinking work and that collective kind of making space for ambivalence, basically, you know, and reckoning with ambivalence, as you were talking about, Cristina, and then also doing this kind of almost constellation work, you know, that you were talking about, Maša, as well, that I really, really liked. And so I guess my kind of question is, what do you think of this idea of kind of activism as parenthesis? Because, you know, oftentimes I think one of the things that interested me in this series of seminars is this unusual kind of collocation of ambivalent activism. You know, it's the first thing I thought about, that you don't you know, necessarily put these things together, but you know, often it's, you know, the whole point is to kind of make space to kind of actually think and sort of envision the future, if you like. So yeah, so what do you think of this idea of activism as a kind of parenthesis, but something active, you know?
Maša and then Cristina.
I mean, I personally think that ambivalent activism, it fits together perfectly. I've always thought of activism as something ambivalent or resistance. I don't think it exists in its pure idealized form. I think it has to have its other side. And so, yeah, I think the connection of these two issues, resistance, activism, which we usually associate with a more perhaps, I don't know, heroic, virtuous disposition, and what you're trying to do with ambivalence, you know, negative emotions, so-called bad feelings, uncertainty, failure, all these issues. And I think it has to go together. I don't think you have activism without that other side.
Really helpful. Cristina.
Yeah, I agree with Maša that the two go together whether you want it or not. I think by virtue of assigning yourself to a social issue, you're kind of going against the grain and against bigger powers. So it's hard to be fully committed at any given time and not feel hopeless or not feel like everything is pointless. But I think there's strength to be taken out of that. And for me, that's kind of going back to the notion of community. For me, that's where being in community comes in. That's why I wouldn't be able to individualize my activism, because I take strength from other people. And then I liked Callum's, I guess, summary of the presentations we did, which I feel like it fits mine particularly well, in that activism is actively creating the active creation of a space. And that's certainly something I was trying to get across. I think what I was trying to get across is that activism is the creation of a space, but we can expand what that space is about, or what we're creating an action or activism around. It doesn't have to be the kind of more traditional social justice a list of social justice issues we're going for. And it certainly, activism has been that for me. It's been creating a space where I can think against the grain and be against the grain, and find people who are like-minded. And at the same time, ambivalence is inextricably part of that space, because the first example that comes to mind is that I would organize with anti-capitalists, but at the same time, we all have our day jobs that we're very dependent on. So there's that ambivalence there. Neither of us has the luxury to afford to not participate in capitalism, but we are creating that anti-capitalist space. So yeah, I definitely feel like activism is, like Helen said, the active action of creating a space, and ambivalence is inextricably a part of it, because of the virtue of the world we live in.
Wonderful. This is really nice. That was a great question from Callum, and like two very thoughtful responses. So we have 7 minutes left, and I see that Dina has another question. But before I come to that, does anyone else have a question for our speakers? Otherwise, I think we'll end with Dina's question. So we'll probably have time for 2 more questions. So just a last call for alcohol, as it were. All right, Dina, do you want to unmute and ask your question?
Yeah, I think, yeah, basically it's just, I think there is a great deal of difficulty and emotional labor involved in sustaining ambivalence, being open and being critical, and avoiding binaries and embracing uncertainty and staying with discomfort and learning from failure. So I think these things involve a lot of emotional work and are very taxing, particularly if you're doing it for a long time. And I think, I mean, my question, and I'm asking that myself, how do you deal with the emotional labor of doing this?
It's a great question. Maša and then Cristina.
I love your question. Thank you, Konstantina. I think I'm not sure there's an easy answer to this. I'm not sure it's something you can do all the time. I think it's a process. I think it's a constant emotional labor, as you were saying yourself. But I think a part of it, and an important part of it, speaking from a political theory perspective, is to dislodge the expectation that it's supposed to be pure, that we have inherited from the modern revolutionary tradition, and that we are still beholden to a certain extent. And I think a part of this emotional labor also consists in that, to kind of acknowledge there are gray zones. We are operating in difficult conditions of systemic violence, and these gray zones will stem from that, if nothing else. So there's really no way to get out of the context in which we're operating and be kind of standing outside, pure, virtuous, and so forth.
Wonderful. Cristina.
I think for me, the notion of emotional labor is often connected to burnout. And the short answer to how to deal with burnout is I don't know. I've yet to find a nicely packaged answer to that in my own activism, but I think a first step is to value that emotional labor, because when you do so and when you give it its rightful place in organizing, you're more aware of the people who are doing that labor, and you can ask them for ways to support them. You can look out for them and see if they're doing too much. And again, this brings back my own understanding of activism, which needs to be a communal practice, because then you can look out for each other and look out for those signs of someone doing too much emotional labor or someone not being able to sustain the emotional labor they're doing. So yeah, I think this is just, like I said, I still struggle with that, and definitely in my community, people still struggle with burnout, and other people might be better at doing the emotional labor than others. So I think the first steps are to make the distribution of this labor a bit more equal if possible, but primarily be on the lookout for each other and be able to look out for someone burning out because of emotional labor, or for someone not being able to sustain the emotional labor they're maybe required to do.
Thank you, Cristina. A really nice way to kind of end our session is to say, care always has to be at the center of any kind of serious and sustainable activism. I think that's something that we could all learn the lesson of and have to relearn, constantly relearn that lesson. So with 2 minutes left, let me, will you join me in thanking our two fabulous speakers, Maša and Cristina, for an absolutely fantastic session. Could not have been happier with how things unfolded, how your talks spoke to each other, and this opportunity to really think about activism in a different way. And I think kind of drawing on both of your talks to say that, you know, if we're serious about kind of thinking differently about activism, then I think it's about refusing these heroic and triumphant, to use Maša's words, emotions with regards to that activism is complex, it is not pure, and we have to kind of embrace the ugly, the negative, alongside the pure and triumphant, to kind of think differently about our world. So with that said, thank you guys very much. We're going to do this again Friday, the 6th of May, we have 2 fantastic talks. We hope to see you then. All details are on our website, but in the meantime, we'll email you with a copy of this Zoom recording, and then look out, hopefully by May, we'll have our special issue proposal together, and we'll send that out to you guys as well. So thank you very much for a fantastic session. Thank you for thinking with us, and I hope you guys have a great afternoon. Thank you. See you later.
Just to say thanks so much again to the